Welcome to our first official IX Open in France. My apologies in advance for kicking off the event in English. This will be our only session in English. Otherwise, the rest of the day will be awesome content from our team based here in Paris and some really great external speakers as well. At our last year's IX Open, we introduced a concept that we think was then and is today incredibly important for the future of our ecosystem. And that was that programmatic skeleton key is identity. And the basic premise behind that is we believe our entire ecosystem has been built atop of the cookie. The cookie is very, very brittle. It's been a crutch, and it's been one that has swung a lot of power over the walled gardens. And we think that the next chapter of programmatic is going to eradicate that. But to kick off this event, to kick off IX Open, we also wanted to cover another very important topic, which is really where we're going to start today, which is the consumer. In the last year, there's been some dramatic changes in the marketplace around the consumer's perception of data and targeting and really this overall ecosystem. And so we wanted to kick off the event there because we believe the big winners tomorrow will be those that take the consumer seriously, that put trust back in their minds, and that ultimately reestablish some of these bridges. So let's get started. So from privacy and data leakage to the growth in ad blocking, and even bad actors doing things like draining mobile device batteries, the consumer's perception of digital is frankly on the decline. And this represents a fundamental problem to particularly the programmatic ecosystem because this problem is now prompting responses. But when we look at this as a problem, we look at two different roads. On one hand, you can take the pessimistic road, but on the other hand, you can take the optimistic road. And as a wise man once said, an optimist sees the opportunity in every challenge. We just have to look at it the right way, and that's how we're starting to look at what's playing out in the backdrop of everything going on today. So to use a fun little example to kick off the event, thinking about this consumer and thinking about this mainstream perception, sometimes it's good to look at the wrong way our overall ecosystem can look to the consumer. So let's walk through a really basic example. Suppose I've got a friend who loves to knit, and they've got a birthday coming up, so I decide to buy them a few balls of yarn. I go to this lovely website over here to do a transaction. As a consumer, whether I know it or not, in a very passive capacity, I'm starting to create an ad targeting profile. And so this little piece of information gets stored on my behalf. And then let's say I continue navigating the web. I see this funny looking dog picture on social media. I click on it because I absolutely have to know what noise is making this dog react like this. I'm continuing to build this profile. Now this profile thinks I might like knitting, maybe knitted sweaters, might think I like pets or dogs. And then the magic of programmatic starts to come together. And it starts to put all these data points together. And it spits out something that might look like this. Maybe I'm in market for this lovely looking dog sweater over here. And while this is kind of a funny example, to the consumer, strange things like this do happen from time to time, and they start to inflate some of these perceptions that, there's some weird or maybe some creepy things going on. And in the backdrop of everything else happening from, Facebook and some of these articles in the mainstream, it's just compounding this consumer perception. So we have a name or a phrase for this funny little dog over here, and we call it the ad targeting monster. And we do that because in the mainstream, everything else is playing out. This is just inflating this perception, and it's leading to responses from major platforms who are now trying to position themselves in the position of being consumer first, and really trying to position themselves in the position of enforcement. So we had a big example of that this year to kick off the year. For those of you familiar, CES is hosted every year in Las Vegas. And Apple ran this pretty bullish billboard to kind of take a very forward stance that they're looking at all of these elements playing out in the marketplace, and they want to respond to that ad targeting monster by being the consumer's hero. And so what's interesting to us is this is effectively unprecedented in the market, where big platforms that have huge reach and huge opportunities to make sweeping changes to our ecosystem are now actually taking steps and making changes to the way everything functions. And so we think it's useful to start to look at how these responses to trust can actually have implications on our business. So for those of you not familiar, this is the Safari logo, which is Apple's web browser. Apple has really taken this consumer-first position and this sort of hero to ad targeting for actually quite some time. It started initially as the Safari browser blocking third-party cookies, which it's been doing for quite some time. More recently, it's upped the rhetoric and upped the responses with ITP, or Intelligent Tracking Protection, now up to version 2.2. So what we set out to do is just look at, from the lens of Safari, when a browser starts to lose addressability because of these platform responses, what happens? And so we studied a few auctions in March of this year, 7 billion to be exact in this market, against the Safari browser, just to start to look at how losing addressability has an implication on our business. And so the first observation that we made is, if you look at this from the marketer's lens, when opportunities are made available programmatically through the market on the Safari browser, they tend to get far less bids. And that really makes a lot of sense. If you think about it, you can't really use any form of data or addressability with these impressions. It's very difficult to do things like attribution and frequency capping, and so they're not very attractive. On the average, they get less than a third of every other bid from every other browser. So data point number one is they're not particularly attractive to marketers. But the other and more stark data point is this data point, which is even when we do see a bid, so even when we do see a bid less than a third of the time, the bids are really low. So now this browser that has all this reach and all this activity relative to the marketer is not very attractive, and even when they are interested in trying it out, they're not bidding very much. So these implications are actually real, and they're having a real impact on our business already. We also wanted to look at trending, because the reality is sometimes things improve. Our market is always pushing the boundaries. Contextual targeting is an alternative in addressability, which is often deployed. First-party data is another alternative that is often deployed. What are the tea leaves saying? What is the trending saying? Based on the data that we're looking at, the trending is moving in the opposite direction, which means these impressions are actually becoming less attractive to marketers. And if you think about this in the broader background, or the backdrop of our market, we are working in a growth market. Advertising is growing, digital advertising is growing, and programmatic is still hyper-growing. So with more money in the market, we're seeing less money directed here, which means we can kind of infer from this there's a direct correlation between addressability and a marketer's budget. So this is one example of kind of trust and enforcement responses to this consumer perception. But let's take a look at Chrome. There was an awful lot of chatter this year in the lead up to Google I/O, which was hosted in May. A lot of rumors about what Google might announce, how the Chrome browser might change, and Google absolutely had some announcements at I/O that we think are worth looking at. The first announcement that Google made at I/O is a very, very forward stance on the practice of browser fingerprinting. Effectively, Chrome is going to war against this practice. We agree with this move because we think this practice is not transparent and not in the consumer's control. But if you're not familiar with it, effectively, browser fingerprinting kind of takes signals that your browser sends out, whether you're aware of them or not. Something as innocuous as the fonts on your laptop or the apps or toolbars you have installed, and things that you might not even think about, like the speed at which your device renders content is used as a signal for the speed of the device. It all gets mashed together in this fingerprint. You don't really know it's there. You can't really control it, and Google's effectively putting that practice out of business. There was a lot of companies that were trying to get in front of the cookie by using this technique, and they're not going to be able to anymore. We do agree with this move. They made two other announcements as well, along the lines of their response to the cookie. The first announcement is actually a fundamental change to the way cookies work on the web. But it's actually fairly basic, and it's not likely to change our business anytime soon. But it does set a series of events into motion that do suggest changes to come. And that first change is changing the way cookies work from a declaration perspective. It's a little bit technical, but if you're not aware, today if you set a cookie on a domain, that cookie can be read from that domain. So if I set a cookie on facebook.com, I can read that cookie on facebook.com. That cookie can also be read all over the web, so you can read that cookie anywhere else too. As of this change, if you wish to use a cookie in the third party, if you wish to use a cookie cross-site, you must declare that intention. And that's a change to the web, because now Google is going to require that anytime any form of cross-site tracking is conducted, you declare that up front and you make that aware. The browser will probably then turn that into transparency controls for the consumer later, but we don't know how those work yet. The second change they announced to cookies is at some point in the future, Chrome will require that any cross-site cookie be secure by default, which isn't a huge change. These are the only two changes that Chrome announced. So if you compare this to Apple, it's actually relatively soft. But we also saw this interesting quote. This we found in an announcement that they also made after the Google I/O event in the Internet Engineering Task Force's papers. This was subject Incrementally Better Cookies by Google. And this quote sort of says, what they recognized while they were thinking about what to do about the cookie, the complexity of replacing it outright was extreme, so they didn't opt to do that yet. But they're effectively signaling their intention at some point to eliminate the cookie. So Google didn't go the whole way yet, but they are signaling their intention to move in this direction. And to kind of round out the browser enforcement responses to this consumer perception, we have the Microsoft Edge browser. They were hosting an event at the same time as I/O. They call it Microsoft Build. And this was their big announcement for Edge, which effectively was putting the consumer first. There's a privacy oath that they've committed to, which is control, transparency, respect, and protection. And in the vein of protection, they'll be bringing out an interface like this to consumers at some point soon, which will allow control over tracking and cookies. And so what this effectively means is by the end of this year or sometime early next year, every major browser will have responded to consumer trust in some capacity. And those aren't the only responses. We have new regulations. GDPR has fundamentally reset at least the programmatic ecosystem. I'd argue it's made some pretty fundamental changes to the web experience as well, where we're effectively starting to put steps in front of the consumer traveling the web. But we now have new examples of that coming even in North America, particularly in California soon, that feel a lot more like GDPR. So I think in a way, your market is ahead. But what this signals to us is that a consumer-first approach going forward is absolutely table stakes. There's no ignoring this trend. So, when we have conversations about what's going on in the marketplace, the implications all these browsers have, the implications of regulation, there's often, kind of a counter narrative that comes up, which is, does any of this matter, or could this actually just be really good? Maybe tracking and targeting and all these things were just bad. They harmed our market. They diluted media spend by allowing money to go everywhere else. And if it all goes away, we'll see marketing return to the way it was before. We'll see ad spend return. Everything will kind of go back to the pre-targeting era. Our position on that one is that's not going to happen. As much as it would be nice to think it will, we actually think marketing has fundamentally been disrupted by the walled gardens and is not going back. And so I want to walk through a few examples on why we think this. The most common response that we field when talking about this subject and talking about all these changes occurring is that if you lose the cookie and you lose ad targeting, everybody will flock back to contextual. And contextual absolutely works and will be conducted tomorrow just as it is today. You can tease out some form of intent from some URLs. You can get some sense of a flavor for what the consumer is interested in. Contextual targeting absolutely works, but it does have drawbacks. The first drawback is scale. Not every URL is actually going to emit a signal which will be conducive to a marketer result. But the bigger drawbacks are the less interesting and the more boring things. And those are things like frequency capping and recency management and attribution. We say a lot of bad about the cookie because it's bad at a lot of things. It was actually pretty good at those. And when you can't do those well, you start to break down some of the fundamentals in our marketplace because the other side of the equation from the marketer side really starts to break down. It's not just about targeting, it's about everything else. The next common solve that's proposed is first-party data. We also agree this is used a lot today, and this will be used a lot tomorrow. When we say cookies are going away, what we actually mean is third-party cookies or cross-site cookies. First-party cookies are relatively protected. They haven't changed much fundamentally in Apple, and we don't expect them to change much fundamentally in Chrome and other browsers. First-party cookies are a little better than contextual because you can start to build up a profile over time. First-party cookies also can solve some of these elements. You can do first-party frequency capping on-site. You can't do it off-site. But where they suffer is ultimately attribution and the ability to do anything on a global basis still can't be done on just a first-party cookie. So we don't believe this solve will work 100%. And what we find is often not said when people think about all the changes playing out and all the implications of those changes is that fully addressable people-based marketing, the Facebook style of marketing, is completely immune to all these changes. Facebook does not need a cookie. More than 80% of all their revenue comes through mobile devices which don't have cookies. They're all linked to an authenticated user and an authenticated identity. As a result, they're able to claim an awful lot of attribution credit, whether they created it or not, and they're able to do global frequency capping and recency management across devices. So when you think about the marketer for a second and you think about where they might opt to move their money, as we lose this cookie on the web and we lose addressability on the web, our belief is that they're going to disproportionately start to skew more budgets towards these walled gardens because their ability to conduct addressable advertising will actually not be affected whatsoever. We also now have case studies, or at least the beginnings of them, for what happens after some of these enforcement measures come into effect. When GDPR was first introduced, at least the headlines that we saw in our region, there was some belief that this might represent a check to the titans of the valley, these walled gardens. It might throttle some of their growth or otherwise make the market a little more level. But what we've seen before the institution of GDPR and after the institution of GDPR, these are Facebook's revenues in Europe, there really hasn't been much change. They're continuing to grow and they're continuing to take share, despite the fact this relatively significant regulation was instituted in response to this consumer perception. So far, the first attempt at checking them hasn't really done much other than continue to secure their position in the marketplace. And if you think about the way Facebook operates, this is certainly legally debatable right now, and I believe it's also playing out in the courts, but Facebook is requiring consent to use the service. So not only are they authenticated, which reduces the need to use cookies at all, but consent's required to use the service, which allows them to comply with the regulation. That's a bit of a problem if you think about trying to find a way to check their growing power. So when we think about all these things playing out and we think about what's happening, particularly from the marketer's lens, we look at this as a function of changing and evolving habits. And so we looked at parallels for where this has happened before, where technology has run into industries. And the one that we point to today is the music business. The music business, too, was disrupted by technology. It wasn't too long ago now that we used to buy albums in stores like this, but then Napster happened, and other services like Napster. And consumers chose or started to choose the freedom of choice. Their habits started to evolve. They abandoned the album sales model. They abandoned stores. They stopped going to stores like this. And this was a really, really, really big problem for the music business. This was a problem whereby the music business was being disrupted by technical innovation. The music business had a pretty big response. They all gathered together and banded together, sued Napster. They won. Napster lost. This was hailed as an absolutely huge victory for the music business. And the hope was, in response to this, everything would start to revert back to the way it was before. Consumers would go back to stores, album sales would rebound. This victory would ultimately undo the habit. Unfortunately, that did not happen. What happened instead was this. That problem was turned into an opportunity. Those habits evolved. Consumers wanted to maintain choice and freedom and accessibility. And so rather than assuming things would go back to the way they were before, this was turned into a massive opportunity, which I think we all know the rest of the story. And so from where we stand, whether it's listening or buying music to planning and buying media, as these habits evolve, as technology disrupts the way things operate, rarely do we see progress regress. We usually see it progress. And undoubtedly to us, addressability works, and we don't think marketing is going back. So to try to visualize a lot of the changes that we see coming together, we've put together this little chart, which I'll walk you through. But you can kind of look at it as two polar opposites. On the left, we've got our fun little dog, which, we can say it was not accurate, but that was actually addressable advertising. It was just done wrong. And on the right, we can look at Facebook, which effectively views the world from the lens of people. Facebook sees everybody as a human authenticated into the service. And so when we start to think about addressability, I'd say our little ad targeting monster on that side is an example of everything done wrong, a very inaccurate form of addressability. And then on the right, we can look at Facebook or something people-based as the most accurate form of addressability we can do. And so we can kind of start to look at how things play out as we look at what's going to happen to the cookie. So addressability matters. The accuracy of that addressability matters. What also matters today, especially in regulated environments, is consent. And as I mentioned before, Facebook's actually in an incredible position to obtain consent from their users because they require it to use the service. So we can kind of start to see, in some capacity, the obtainment of consent and the authentication of users are actually kind of linked. So as we start to look at what will change in our marketplace, as the cookie kind of decays and eventually goes away, the inoptimal forms of addressability, the less accurate forms of addressability, will actually start to become impossible. And this will actually feel like a win to the consumer. You won't actually be able to do the example I showed before because it won't be possible. But the other really important point to note is Facebook will actually be pretty well defended. They're going to have consent, and they're going to have the ability to do addressability without a cookie. So they've got a nice little moat forming despite all these enforcement measures that are at play. And so that's why we also believe that marketer budgets are going to follow the exact same paradigm. Where there's addressability that is accurate with consent, marketer budgets are going to continue to flow. And even though all this trust enforcement is going to start to eradicate some of our little chart here, we think they're going to end up doing pretty well. And so what we also think will start to emerge, imagine a year or two forward, Chrome has effectively completed all of their work. They have completely replaced the cookie with something else. Apple's continued on its strategy. Microsoft has moved a little bit farther along. There really aren't third-party cookies the way they operate today. There really isn't cross-site tracking the way it operates today. What we think will start to happen is the web as we know it is going to become a lot more anonymous. For buying yarn and looking at pet pictures, we're not going to assume that people are keeping a profile on us or tracking. It's just literally going to be impossible. And so we think that that web over time is going to start to evolve, to feel kind of lonely and very anonymous. And there'll be this big wedge between the web as we know it and this other version of experiences, which we think will become authenticated experiences. And we think the difference is going to be the choice of the consumer as to which one they choose. And this is where we think opportunity will present itself, because we also think there will be a counterbalance to that anonymous web, which we're affectionately calling the trusted web. We believe that publishers that are in a position to establish trust with consumers, many of you in the room have already done that and have done that for decades. you will be in a very good position to establish a value exchange with the consumer, akin to the value exchange of Facebook, whereby, without the need for cookies, authentication can occur to bring addressability back to the web that wasn't there before. And then I think fundamentally there will be a choice that the consumer will take between a web that feels a little different and a web that feels a little more trusted. And the other hope that we have is that as we get to this place, we can actually start to knock down the walled gardens a peg, because we believe that addressability in trusted environments will actually become worth far more to the marketer. I want to walk through one more parallel, which I think starts to set the stage for what we think happens next. And this is an analogy of just video footage quality. It wasn't too long ago that we, as consumers watching a video, would look at something like this and immediately say, the camera's shaky, the content's very pixelated. This is an unprofessional video, obviously. It wasn't produced, it's probably not worth our time. But things started to evolve. Economies of scale arrived, massive innovations in camera technology took place, and it wasn't too long before anyone could produce video footage quality like this. It was near indiscernible from the video footage quality of a big camera rig. This video and the last video look completely different, but they were actually both amateur videos. This is a video of this guy shredding his way down a hill. Pretty boring video, but it looks absolutely gorgeous. Just because we commoditize video footage quality, we didn't fundamentally commoditize content. Consumers don't spend a lot more time watching beautiful videos that are boring. They still crave really, really good content. And so to show a third video, this is a video that was produced by Red Bull, really good choreographed storyline, 1 million+ views. Looks exactly the same from a video footage quality as the prior video, but is really compelling to watch. It's worth your time. And so as consumers, we've evolved. Our perception of quality footage alone isn't enough. We want more. We want content that's actually worth our time too. And so we believe this example sort of showcases, even if you commoditize one element of the chain, in this case the quality of the camera, you don't actually commoditize content. So what we believe is that the walled gardens did not actually commoditize content. That's something that's said an awful lot in the marketplace. We think that's wrong. We think that content is still king, and particularly trusted content is still king. And we believe that all of the research is on our side on this one. Reputable journalism matters more in our society than ever before. Trust matters more in our society than ever before, and we don't see that changing anytime soon. So if the walled gardens didn't commoditize content, what did they commoditize? Because they did commoditize something. And we believe that the power of addressability commoditized the value of content as the primary vehicle for effective advertising. It's a lot of words, but in short, what we believe is that addressability simply performed better. When you had it, it trumped environment as a means to achieve a marketer's result. And so we also believe in order to return the volley, or in order to effectively rewrite the script, we have to commoditize something ourselves, and that is addressability. And so as we go forward, we think that the experiences in our day-to-day lives in digital and on the web will start to morph to look a little bit more like this. And so to walk you through an example of where we think the addressable tomorrow will net out, let's start with a brand or a marketer. We believe that consumers will continue to trust and believe in and buy from the brands that they love. And we believe that those brands will continue to market on the web, just like they do in Facebook today, with customer lists and loyalty lists, and all the other vehicles they use today to spend their money. We also believe that the value exchange will start to come into effect between content and the consumer. We already subscribe to this today in other forms. We authenticate into Spotify or Netflix, yet we expect our content for free. We think this is going to change. We think that in order to gain access to the content that we want and that we trust, we're going to have to authenticate, which will separate that from this sort of anonymous web that we're evolving into. And then we also believe the combination of both will allow addressable advertising to still work. The difference is going to be it will be highly accurate because it will be based on a people-based signal, not a brittle cookie. There'll be no behavioral targeting. There'll be no cookies. And you won't need walled gardens to conduct advertising this way. And we think that by doing so, we'll effectively turn this vehicle of advertising into something that anybody can do instead of something that you can only do through a Facebook. I don't think it's widely known, but Facebook's biggest moneymaker is its custom audiences product, which does over $24 billion every year. And the vast majority of its spend is conducted through marketers uploading lists, their customer files and their CRM files, matching them to audiences in Facebook, and conducting the most addressable forms of marketing we've ever seen before. And don't forget that there's also the attribution side of that product as well. Facebook is able to attribute pretty much every conversion that a marketer will see because it touches almost everybody else on the planet. We want everyone to be able to do this, and we think this is where we will evolve because we don't see any other alternatives to conduct addressable advertising as all these trust enforcement measures come into effect. On the other side, we think that there will still be a web, and we still think that consumers will, where they choose to, they won't authenticate, they'll surf the web, they'll be very anonymous. But we think that web's actually going to start to feel a lot like it did 15 or 20 years ago, where it'll look kind of like this. There'll be a lot of content still. There'll be a lot of diluted content. There'll still be advertising, but the advertising will not be particularly effective. It'll be very direct response. And when we're on this other web, we will feel like we're on this other web. And we're probably not going to spend a lot of time on it because it will start to evolve to look really different than the web of today. And that's where we think we will be able to also evolve the consumer habit, where they will want to spend more time in trusted environments, where they'll opt to authenticate because they're not necessarily going to want to spend time in an environment that really lacks trust. And so that brings us back to trust. And so to the publishers in this room, we believe that you are the trusted web. You are what the walled gardens are not. Your brands have spent decades establishing that trust with the consumer. And in the road ahead, we think that is going to be of paramount importance to all these other changes playing out in our marketplace. But don't take my word for it. I believe this is true because each and every day, your brands tell the consumer what they need to know. Your brands report the issues to the consumers that they trust, and that trust has been established over a very long period of time. One of your brands is each of these headlines here, and we think that that isn't going to change anytime soon, and we think that that thirst for quality and trust will actually just grow over time in these times that we're living in. So that's our start. Big changes coming into our marketplace, but we think that they represent opportunities for tomorrow. We're a technology company at our heart. More than half of our company is engineering. We do love problems, and we also love working with and for companies that we believe in, and we think that a lot of these problems can be solved, and new opportunities tomorrow will present. We've got a great lineup of speakers and content throughout the day. We'll get into more product-specific approaches to how we're approaching the marketplace and our platform, and customers are thinking about these challenges as well. So thank you all, and welcome to IX Open.